It's a thing you never knew you needed. A movie about a black bear spun out on cocaine like a 1980s entertainment agent on a long weekend bender. The best part, the story is true-ish. Let's follow the white lines and say hello to the bear's little friends. I mean, references and details. Naturally, the best part of Cocaine Bear is that it's based on a real story. While it's often true that truth is stranger than fiction, in this case, fiction did have to put a bit of a thumb on the scale. In the real story, the coked out bear was discovered long after ingesting an estimated $2 million worth of the powder that powered the 80s, having not survived the experience with no other victims. While the movie acts as a redemption story of sorts for the real bear dubbed Pablo Escobear by giving her a chance to lash out at people who just left their cocaine laying about, there is one real-life victim that makes the movie, Andrew Norton II. Norton was a former narcotics officer who broke bad and became a smuggler. He was found with a non-functioning parachute in a Kentucky driveway with a duffel bag full of a potentially lengthy prison stay, except it didn't result in prison since he did not survive the fall. Before Norton's unintended free fall, he had thrown out several bags of cocaine. The movie filled in the blanks about what happened up in the air, but it's generally assumed that the plane was overloaded and the ditching of the cargo was an attempt to save the craft. When that didn't work, the added weight from the bag he did save was too much for the parachute to handle. Roadside attractions have a big job. They have to convince the traveler that it's worth stopping on their way to actual destinations to take a look at their cool stuff and maybe leave a little money behind. A tried and true method is appealing to the driver's inner 12-year-old. Just ask the Uranus Fudge Factory in Uranus, Missouri, a very real place that very much leans into the bit all the way. In the small town of Villa Rica, Georgia, there's a former mine that offers tours. Thanks to its cheeky name, it gets a billboard appearance in Cocaine Bear. That name? Ye Old Glory Hole. If you don't know why that's funny, make sure Safe Search is on before you look it up. Speaking of which, you don't want any holes in your YouTube content, so fill yours with the glory of more Screen Rant by hitting that like and subscribe buttons and ringing that notifications bell for the latest in your inbox. Where else could you learn how to experience being a cocaine bear without shape-shifting powers or a debilitating habit? I mean, other than later in this video. The proliferation of cocaine in the 1980s was just one of the existential crises of the decade where hippies sold out and became yuppies. The other was the long-running Cold War sputtering out its last decade of existence. While previous decades had things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, by the 80s the Cold War was really more of a premise machine for patriotic movie fare like Red Dawn or Rocky IV.
I must break you.
The FX show The Americans visited the 80s Cold War via popular fear at the time, deep-cover Russian spies posing as normal American families. The show starred Kerry Russell and Matthew Rhys as the titular Americans and legendary character actor Margot Martindale as one of their no-nonsense handlers. Martindale steals the show as the park ranger looking for some alone time with the wildlife conservationist Peter. Russell, of course, plays the nurse and mother whose child and her best friend are in the path of the amped-up apex predator. Her former TV husband Rhys plays Thornton, who threw the cocaine out of the plane to start the shenanigans ball rolling. Shows like Stranger Things have managed to take 80s nostalgia to near fetishistic levels. Neons and pastels do battle to the music of Kate Bush. 80s nostalgia plays a lot more Kate Bush than the 80s played Kate Bush. Production company and animation giants Lord Miller Productions 80'd up their studio logo at the beginning of the movie. If the cocaine bear is real, whatever became of the 80s real party animal? Dr. Kenneth Alonzo, who had the sad task of autopsying the bear, had it taxidermied and put on display at the Chattahoochee River Recreation Area until a wildfire moved it into storage where it was stolen. Someone made off with the whole bear. The bear made its way to a pawn shop before it ended up in the hands of Waylon Jennings. That Waylon Jennings, the voice that told a generation that them Duke boys sure got themselves in a heap of trouble. And I think he sang some notable country songs as well. Pablo Escobear now resides in Kentucky, in the Kentucky Fun Mall in, you guessed it, Kentucky. Riffing on the 80s is almost as old as the 80s themselves, and director Elizabeth Banks has some familiarity with that. One of her first movies was the send-up of camp comedy movies of the 80s, Wet Hot American Summer. The movie poked fun at all the camp comedy tropes: sex-curious teens, sex-starved counselors, the kid too cool for the camp that's won over, the square that learns to rebel. Jane by Jefferson Starship makes an appearance in that movie, and this one as a nod to her early work. Of course, we all know that there's a far more famous bear who has long been the spokesperson for putting out your campfires and being careful with your cigarette butts, and maybe not having a gender reveal party with pyrotechnics in an area with dry vegetation prone to wildfires. Since the movie's bear takes a dramatic turn from the original Pablo Escobear, the crew ended up nicknaming the movie bear with a variation on the more famous bear's name, dubbing him Smokey the Bear. Smokey does make an appearance though in the ranger station as part of naturalist Peter's introduction. The popular idiom, "in the future everyone will be famous for 15 minutes," could never have predicted the internet and what it would do with the notion of fame or its life cycle. For better or worse, now you have to add the internet to the list of places you might have seen that person before. That's the case with Tom the Paramedic, which might seem familiar to those who spend time on TikTok or Reels. Stand-up Scott Seiss has made a niche for himself, making videos sending up common assumptions about retail from both the customer and worker side. He even did one to promote this movie in his recognizable style, sending up the everything you need to know before seeing videos, pointing out that if you know the words cocaine and bear, you are good. This is Seiss's first feature role. Sure, it's fun to watch a movie about a bear hopped up on cocaine, but wouldn't it be cool to be a bear hopped up on cocaine? Probably not, but thanks to the wonder of video games, we can pretend with only the good parts. To promote the movie, the website has a Pac-Man style game where you collect cocaine, naturally, and maul drug dealers. What could be better? Cocaine Bear is the platonic ideal of blended effects. Smokey the Bear himself is not real. Instead, motion capture artist and Andy Serkis pupil Alan Henry has his performance as Cokie captured and the all-digital bear is blended with the all-practical gore effects. For their part, the gore effects were too good for director Banks. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, she noted that the death of Norwegian backpacker Olaf was much more graphic and included his severed face. Banks figured that by the time Olaf falls victim to the bear, the movie is deep in its third act, and the decision was made to reel it back in lieu of bringing the personal arcs to a conclusion. Plus, you need to leave something for the extended home version. For better or worse, we're in the age of the franchise now. With Cocaine Bear being based on a true story that already had a bunch added to it, you might think that this movie is sequel-proof. But they made a franchise out of a movie whose catchphrase was, "There can only be one." So, of course I can! Banks has said she's open to a sequel as long as the script is good and fans already have one in mind that keeps the loosely based on true events theme going. Recently, 3.2 tons of the powdery white stuff was pulled out of the Pacific Ocean, which means only one thing: cocaine shark. Naturally, Banks doesn't want to go against one of the greatest natural horror movies of all time, so she also would want the script to be as far away from Jaws as possible. You may not expect a comedy horror gore fest about a coked out bear to have a heady reference to early 20th century art, but you'd be wrong. One of the complications and sources of bonus violence is a trio of ne'er-do-wells that have been jumping out of the bushes and robbing hikers at knife point. The gang, the Duchamps, meet their match in the worst place to meet one's match, a gas station bathroom. Marcel Duchamp was an artist and prominent figure in the Dada art movement that embraced absurdity as a send-up to notions of truth, representation, and the power of context. Perhaps the most notorious of Duchamp's work is a piece called Fountain, where the artist took down a urinal and signed it R. Mutt and placed it in an art gallery, illustrating that the simple act of placing something in the context of art will grant it art status.
This cannot be. It's the devil's work.
The original Fountain was destroyed, prompting Duchamp to simply find another urinal and sign it. Unlike the fixtures in the movie, Fountain wasn't destroyed by O'Shea Jackson Jr.'s David, smashing Duchamp's head through it. Cocaine Bear was filmed during the pandemic, and Banks looked at the story as a bit of a metaphor for the chaotic nature of the world at the time. To make sure that time wasn't lost on the cast and crew, young Christian Convey, who played Henry the Kid, was put on a 10-day quarantine after coming down with, well, you know. To keep the ball rolling, a stand-in was used for his parts, with Banks doing Henry's lines from behind the camera with a bullhorn. Over the last few years, it seemed like everything is filmed in Georgia. The state has taken film production tax credits and turned Atlanta into a Hollywood of the South. With Georgia standing in for so many locales, it seems easy to take a movie set in Georgia and film it in Georgia. But that's too easy, and filmmaking doesn't like easy. So instead of Georgia, Ireland stood in for Georgia, with the movie being shot entirely on the Emerald Isle. There's another nod to an iconic 80s property lurking in the background of Cocaine Bear in the form of the Lone Pine Mall. The first indication that Marty McFly had changed the present by going into the past was the name change of his hometown from Twin Pines to Lone Pine after the DeLorean took one of the two titular pine trees out upon his arrival to 1955. Why'd they change the name instead of just planting another tree? Don't worry about it. The Lone Pine Mall appears as a name drop in the movie, letting you know that Marty has already done the time dance. Scott Seiss also provides a video list of his own. His is a countdown of other famous bears and how they might fare against the Cocaine Bear in the movie. It's not much of a spoiler to say that Cocaine Bear beats them all. Sorry, Paddington.
A bear did cocaine.